Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session today on Employee Engagement Survey Best Practices. My name is Charles Rogel, work as a consultant here at DecisionWise. I'm joined by my companion here, Skylar.
Hello, everybody. Good to be here with you. Skylar DeYoung, working with Charles for a few years now. He's getting used to my quirks, so maybe not.
And we're going to tag team on this, take a few slides each, and then do some color commentary over as we talk. But essentially what we're trying to do is provide you, I guess, the tips and tricks on how to really run an effective employee engagement survey. And so as we jump into our slides here, what we'll start showing essentially are the best practices we picked up along the way. One thing I'll mention too, this presentation does count towards SHRM ongoing education credit, so you'll get a link to that as we present going live. Let me see. Do we have? Can we present the slides here? Not sure if they're showing.
As you get that pulled up, also put some questions in the chat. We'll try to keep an eye on that throughout. And we do have a presentation, so we might miss some here or there, but we want to make sure to address some, especially if they're right on topic. We'll keep an eye there.
All right. So I think I'm sharing now. There we go. All right. So our agenda is pretty simple. We're going to go over some trends first, talk about engagement, what it means, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts of survey strategy, design, how to administer a survey and get good participation. And then we'll talk about kind of how to analyze your results, create some insights, how you kind of present those and do action planning with it as you run kind of this typical annual employee survey process. So as we've been kind of tracking stuff over the years, we're always talking to our clients, running surveys for different organizations, and we've kind of been keeping a tally on what are the concerns or topics they think are most important to measure on surveys year over year. So we've been tracking this over 5 years. I'm not going to go through all the years with you, but it has kind of shifted and changed a bit as we've kind of navigated through the pandemic. We started seeing kind of major changes back in 2020 as the pandemic hit. And everyone's concerned about safety, diversity, equity, inclusion, communication, productivity, collaboration. These were the were concerned and wanted to measure on the survey to see how people are reacting into this kind of very disruptive environment. Good news is those topics scored really well. People felt like companies were doing a great job to help them accommodate to their needs, be safe. We saw most companies now including diversity, equity, and inclusion direct measure questions on their survey, whereas before it was just like a subset of the population. And now they're kind of a standard section on most surveys that we run. As the pandemic morphed and changed, flexibility, work-life balance, working from home, compensation as we exited the pandemic, workload and stress has always kind of been a topic that's been there, as well as communication. The big shift really was, though, from a direct emphasis on DEI to more of folding it in under the umbrella of culture and measuring these things, but kind of looking at, hey, what is our culture? Is it inclusive? Do people feel comfortable here? And then how do we kind of merge our DEI initiatives under that umbrella? Looking at 2025, what we've got right now is that we'll see compensation as a top topic or concern that comes up. Workload, a little bit, not as much, frankly, as what we might have seen in 2023 and 2022, but it's still there in some areas. Culture and DEI, the B for belonging, is together. And then the new topic that's kind of rising on the list is around process systems, efficiencies, and then communication, top-down communication in organizations as well. Skylar, any other trends or things you're seeing with your clients here?
No, I think you talked about the big ones, especially the compensation that's risen. It's more around the inflation we've seen in macroeconomic aspects. And then the belonging, as you mentioned, too, where we saw in 2023, that kind of came to the forefront of in the DEI world as a big topic. What I've found is great is we've been measuring belonging for years. We've called it connection historically, and we'll see that later on in some slides as part of our magic. But that connection to the organization, that feeling like that sense of belonging is huge for people feeling included and also driving engagement. So I feel like that's been a really great thing to see in the the HR world that's been picked up that we've been trying to measure for years. So it's like, okay, great. We've been measuring this. We can see it, and good to see that kind of grouped in the AI space and that culture space.
So a couple of things as we go through this. As we talk about culture, we usually say it's kind of at the forefront. So it's kind of always there. It's kind of your operating system that's in the background. And you can build it, you can be deliberate about it, you can shape it. Senior leadership plays a big role in this. This is where you're kind of really active about promoting your values and operationalizing them within the organization. But essentially, if you ask employees, it's basically the way we do things around here. And what happens is it really determines how people make decisions, how they interact with your customers, how they interact with other people as well. And so it's kind of an unwritten set of norms that people know are the guidelines in terms of how we do things. That in turn influences the actual experience that people have in an organization. So if your culture is doing a good job to reinforce and live up to the values that it proposes, people generally have a good impact or a good experience overall. And if they're having a good experience, that leads to engagement. So engagement generally is more of an outcome that you're measuring that kind of flows from these different concepts that we're describing here. What is engagement? So we have this two-part definition where it's an emotional state where you feel passionate, energetic, and committed to your work. Then in turn, what you're going to do is want to contribute more, do your best, essentially. So you kind of invest your best selves, your heart, spirits, minds, and hands to really do your best work. And so engagement's kind of always been around. What I'm seeing now in terms of trends is people are kind of trying to maybe redefine it, come up with a new way to talk about what engagement is, because engagement's been around now for a good 20, 25 years. And I think maybe people are getting tired of the term. So I'm seeing terms out here like thriving in an organization or, being energized or whatever. Those different words that I think people are trying to play off of here. But essentially, it still boils down to what we would call engagement. And engagement kind of sits on top of this other piece, which we call satisfaction element. So it's really a foundation upon which engagement can grow. Satisfaction is important because it drives retention. And the elements that influence how satisfied an individual is with their job are things like pay and benefits, safety, remote work is on that list now, resources, stress, things like that. So if those are working for you, a lot of times you don't think about them, but they're important to the job and the role. And if they are working for you, you'll stay longer, but they don't necessarily motivate you. They don't drive performance like engagement does. And engagement's really the energy and passion you feel towards your job. And as we we look at our data over the past 30 years and do driver analysis, these magic elements keep coming up to the top. Now, we had to play with the words a bit to get this acronym to work. So you might say growth is professional development, or autonomy is kind of freedom to do your job, or empowerment. But all these things really emerge as drivers of engagement. Meaning is typically big in healthcare. Impact, if you're kind of a performance-driven organization, growth opportunities are important. We'll touch on these as we go, but these are typically what we're trying to create or have people experience to create engagement. So then that takes us to creating a listening strategy to understand engagement and how motivated people are towards their job. Now, we want to basically listen to employees. And so you should have a strategy. Sometimes a once a year engagement survey is not really enough for a listening strategy, because what we see on these once a year engagement surveys is people say the organization doesn't listen, they're not responsive to ideas, I don't feel like I can speak up. And the engagement survey is like one of those initiatives that helps improve that, but it's not quite enough if that's something you're struggling with. And so you want to be able to respond to the data. So we always say, don't survey as much as you can respond to the data. So we're going to do pulse surveys and other types of surveys. Make sure there's some kind of action coming out as a result.
Right now, we've got a poll going to see how often your organizations or how often you recommend organizations do engagement surveys. So check that out. But to Charles's point, yeah, that one-time listening isn't quite there. You want to have more than just an engagement survey, because that's usually just a pretty. You've got a good breadth of topics, but you're not got a lot of depth, and that's where you can get some pulse surveys or other listening tools as well.
Yeah, and so again, quickly as you can respond and roll out the data, That's how you survey to kind of pulse and see how you're doing. Generally, a year gives you enough time because it takes you, a couple of months to get the survey rolled out, the data rolled out to managers, and then they have time to work on action plans that will hopefully show a difference on the next time you run it. So next topic here, how do you create a culture of feedback? Well, there's several tools and ways you can do this. We're going to talk mainly about these 2 anchor surveys that you might run on an annual basis. But in between, you can do pulse surveys, 360 assessments. You can have kind of a what do you call it? Listening box. What are those called? Suggestion box tool.
Yes, always on.
Yeah, always on. So several ways you can do this and augment this, but the annual survey really gives you a big set of data that you can work with to measure each time. we highly recommend other listening campaigns, but again, be selective to your population and how it will work.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. This all depends on, right, your organizational size, the appetite for what people, and we'll get to the next slide, which is going to talk about the maturity of your organization and employee listening. But we talk about these tools. We want organizations to have a lot of these available, but there is going to be, well, where are we at in a maturity perspective? And also, if we only have 20 employees versus 2,000 employees, those are going to be very different listening strategies. Some might be meet as a whole company in a meeting and talk about this, or we've got to break this out into stages and different months and time periods.
Yeah, because not pictured here are like focus groups, one-on-one interviews, other listening sessions you can do informally.
Yeah.
So talking about the maturity model, I'm going to read every bullet point here. No, I'm just kidding. What we want to show here essentially is that using data takes a little time to kind of acclimate people to an employee survey, using the data, action planning, that sort of thing. So usually the first time someone comes to us to run a survey, never done it before, they're in this kind of measurement or commitment area where there's an intent to maybe ask questions, understand what people think, but there's no afterthought to, are we actually going to do anything when we get this data back? What's the action planning going to look like? And so typically there's a commitment once we share the data with the executive team where it's like, we got to take action. Let's work on 1 or 2 things from the survey. And there's the organization plans that emerge from the measurement or commitment area here. The next step takes some time, the management section. This is where you're getting hands into the data of all managers, for example, that had 5 or more responses within a team. So they get a team report for just the responses within their group. And that's where localized action planning happens. That's where you can start building accountability around leadership and managers really making a difference in the organization or their subgroups. Because if you're trying to lift your scores, so to speak, or improve engagement, you'll find that it differs a bunch throughout different departments and areas. And so you take a more localized approach to your action planning. Once you get up to integration and mastery, this is where you're saying that the people experience is kind of important or is integral to our success. It's a strategic initiative. What are we doing on the people side to create a great place to work where we deliver a great experience to customers or good services or products or whatever it is? So once we have management believing that, hey, a strong EX is important to success, that's when it starts getting integrated throughout the organization. And you're not fighting with managers to do action planning or whatever. They're hungry for the data. They want to use it to kind of create a great environment where people are thriving and delivering their best.
What I like here, I'll call this out, and you kind of mentioned it too, is on these lower phases, you're more reactive to the feedback, right? You can see that on the right-hand column. You're just saying, well, what are people saying? Let's put out fires, right? We've all been in those stages. This is a major problem. Let's go fix this. As we've worked with clients year over year, we start to see consistent results. And then we get into this proactive stage where they're going, okay, well, we're already seeing this trend this way. Let's get out ahead of this. And also, what's our strategic initiatives that we want to do? What do we want to be known for as an organization rather than responding to this fire, that fire, or the problems here and having HR kind of do all that work too?
No, it's a really good.
Management is huge.
Yeah. Because you're not just trying to fix a question on the survey. You're trying to say, what are the questions we need to be asking that create a great experience?
Much more strategic. Yeah.
All right. I think this is where you take over, Skylar.
Yeah, sure. Let me kind of share some of our best practices. So we've talked about how like an annual engagement survey is not quite enough, but let's talk about what we want to see in an annual engagement survey. And some organizations will still do these biannually, and others, and biannually could be every other year or twice a year. But generally, we're seeing around 50 questions within this survey. We'll talk more about how that's broken out or time frame, but within it, we want to break out the organization as best as we can into hierarchy. Are we seeing like the org chart represented in this survey? Can we break this out into different demographics? Can we see managers versus non-managers, different tenure groups? And this really dives deeper into an extensive analysis. And that's what we're doing here at DecisionWise regularly is let's run these surveys. Let's look at what people are saying, and then let's debrief extensively to your executive team. And then share reports for managers and things like that. So that's a lot of the description of what we're seeing from an annual engagement survey. The outcomes of this is hopefully we're establishing a baseline in the first year. In subsequent years, we're going to see what the trending looks like. We're going to see what measures for performance. That's where we get to more of those engagement related things. And then we have various different themes. There's usually between 10 and 15 different themes and then sub themes of questions that fit into those 50 questions. And we're trying to be specific. And like I mentioned before, oftentimes we aren't going super deep. We might ask 3 to 5 questions on organizational communication, which that's a whole topic that you can get into really quickly. But on this annual survey, we want to just get a sense of what's going on in the organization to go, well, where do we need to dig deeper coming out of this? Where are areas we need to listen to more? But hopefully you're empowering managers and promoting the organizational change throughout and leading to that action planning, which we'll talk about later as well. As far as, if you want to go to the next slide, as far as structure of it, as I mentioned, 45, 55, we've found that once you start hitting around 60 questions on this, that's where we start to see participation drop off or apathetic respondents. That's what we call them, where people start selecting the same choice every time. So we want to keep questions usually around under 60 questions, and you can see that's usually around 8 to 10 minutes. Now, the other factor that comes in is how many open text comment questions we ask on the survey. It usually extends the length if we're asking a lot of those. We usually categorize the questions into these 4 categories: questions relevant to a person's job, their team, supervisor, and organization. And those are superior themes, if you will. We call them dimensions. And then, yes, asking a couple open text comments. Our best practice is one around what are the strengths of the organization, what needs some improvement. And then we utilize some custom benchmarks and then show the trending as well. But this is the structure of the survey, and then also some of the analysis of what are we paying attention to on the back end. Some external comparisons and then trending year over year too. Charles, any other notes on this as far as what you'd share?
No, and I think the one thing that stands out of the question we typically hear is people say, wow, 50 questions? That seems like a ton. Doesn't it take forever to complete? And no, it really only takes 8 to 10 minutes. Those comment questions take longer, like a couple minutes to fill out, especially if you're writing a paragraph. So the more comment questions you add, the longer the survey becomes quickly. It becomes much longer. So the regular 5-point agreement scale questions are pretty quick.
Yeah. Yeah. And that I will say, when you're advertising the survey, we usually say, tell people take them 20 minutes and then they'll be really thrilled when it only takes 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Set them up for success that way. But yeah, our average complete times are in that 8 to 10 minute. So as far as our benchmark comparisons, I mentioned briefly, we have these external benchmarks we're comparing to. We have 4-year rolling benchmarks, and our global one is across all organizations. And Charles probably knows the exact number. I think it's around 450, 420, something like that. There are organizations in that benchmark. And then we also have a global one that says, well, let's look at just the last year, because sometimes, as we saw, there's a huge trend between the last 4 years, from 2020 to 2025. We've seen a lot of changes. So what's happening in the last year too, and we can look at that. But we can get pretty granular in these too. We can look at by company size. We've got 43 different industry benchmarks. We usually try to match organizations with our global benchmark and one industry benchmark that's pretty closely related to them. Now, we always get into this bind where clients want to say, well, we want to see organizations exactly like us. Are are these nonprofits the same size as us? Are they the same area of the country? And that gets really tricky because I always joke of like, well, we'd love to work with all of your competitors if that's what you want to see. But even then, they might not ask the same questions. So we try to get it as close as possible and say, here's some external benchmarks, but it's never going to be perfect. This is an organization that looks exactly like you and how they're doing. But we get some.
That's what your CEO is going to ask, is to say, hey, find a company that can compare us to our 5 main competitors, and that doesn't exist.
Yeah, because those 5 competitors are going to different vendors and then asking different questions. Yeah. We get it all the time, but it's a valid concern, right? We want to have valid external benchmarks, and we're concerned about that too. We say, well, we need a certain number of organizations to create an industry benchmark. We can't just say, let's go look at one dentist office and then compare everybody else to that one dentist office.
Yeah. So I want to respond to a question here about shorter surveys. Would a 4-question survey, for example, be sufficient? And you can do, we call that a pulse survey. That's something we might say you could actually run that every month to a subset of your population to kind of get a pulse on how people are feeling about their overall experience. But those questions won't be very actionable. In other words, you'll have to ask general questions maybe about, do you feel like you belong here? Do I feel like I'm engaged in my work? Do I get good communication? So you won't have a lot of data to work with, and it'll be hard to kind of take action on some of those responses because it's just, 4 questions. And so by asking a lot of different questions, you'll start to see themes and trends and different areas to focus on throughout the organization. It's much more comprehensive analysis. The shorter 4 or 5 question surveys, good pulse tools to kind of see sentiment, like are people feeling pretty good or bad about the overall job experience, but they don't give you much actionable data overall.
Yeah, that's a good question. And exactly. You're going to want to say, well, what's the annual versus a pulse and have that part of that listening strategy. It's a good question. All right, let me jump back to these indexes or indices.
Yeah.
So here at DecisionWise, we have multiple different indexes, and what this is where we're taking a subset of questions on one topic, and then we're going to individually take an employee and average their score to those questions. So this is where we measure employee engagement. We talk about it as an employee engagement survey, but really it's a survey around employee experience, and then we measure engagement as part of it. And we do it through the engagement index, where we have some anchor questions for that. We also have intent to stay index and DEI and leadership, where we can say, well, let's identify the questions just relevant to these, and then let's really kind of build out a little bit more analysis relevant to these indexes. So for us, our engagement index, we break individuals out into fully engaged, key contributors, opportunity group, and fully disengaged employees. So we have a little bit more detail and some categories there, some definitions.
Kind of create profiles.
Yep, and different profiles for each employee. So that's where we're doing some of those indexes. As far as anything else you'd add there, Charles?
No, I think that's it. The main one we use is this engagement index. Some clients use like a DEI or leadership one. Intent to stay is another one we use frequently. But engagement, we do a lot of work on. I can do some driver analysis based on.
That's where we've done most of our research as well over the years too, for sure.
Mm-hmm. That's how we came up with the magic model, all that stuff.
Yeah. As far as I kind of called these out earlier. When we organize a survey, we have these 4 major categories, and we'll have anywhere from 2 to 3 questions, usually around 3 or 4 questions per category, up to 20. And admittedly, we've found more insights from the organization questions and the job section. From supervisor sections and teams, it's good to get a sense of what's going on. But in these annual surveys, we've found that if people like their supervisor, they're going to respond, agree, or strongly agree to most questions, and same with their team. So we spend more time on the job or organization section to see what's the employee experience look like. But those are the 4 major areas we're looking at. But also we have, and I kind of called this out earlier, 10 to 15 different themes. And these are some of our overarching major themes we're measuring. You'll see a lot of those magic related themes in there too: meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, connection. And sometimes as I'm working with clients, we change the name connection to belonging to fit within the industry norm of DEIB. But these themes are really another way we can analyze and say, okay, are there certain areas you're scoring higher or lower on, right? Your overall score is one thing, but are we having communication issues, and what does that look like compared to the benchmarks? And between all the different themes and dimensions and benchmarks, we're able to really triangulate pretty well on some areas of potential opportunities and identify some recommendations for leadership on moving forward on what people are saying within the survey. Perfect.
So then we get into basically how to run a survey and what you're trying to do to kind of get good participation and good data set to work with. This is my section, right? So generally, as you're trying to set this up and prepare, we say plan on like a 6 to 8 week runway to get things going, because you're trying to get your employee list set up. You're trying to do a download from your HRIS. You got to organize that data, make sure you have your ducks in a row and organized well. And then the next one, as you do this, is the survey. So you got to figure out what questions we're going to use, and get buy-in on that before you launch it. The admin piece where the survey is actually running is usually a 2-week window. So you're just collecting data, sending out reminders. You're trying to get about 80% of people to take the survey. And then there's kind of the back end where you're rolling out results and reports throughout the organization. 3 weeks, I'd say, is pretty fast. That's kind of when you can have all these debriefs done if you're really organized. But what you find is that your executive team meetings, well, the next one's like a month out. So we got to kind of prepare how we can get the results out in cadence with all these other leadership meetings that are happening. As you're thinking about your hierarchy and demographics, the hierarchy is basically who reports to who, which job functions or which functional areas report up to which areas. And then there's several other demographics you can use on your survey. All of this you can kind of measure or capture on the back end. So you're not asking these questions on the survey. These are all kind of tied to individual responses within the system, but then you're protecting confidentiality by not reporting on any group that has less than 5 responses. But you get some really good data this way and good comparisons to see what's going on in your organization.
I'll make a note there. Also, I want to note we've got a poll going on. So get in there and let us know what is your hardest part of your survey process. But as far as the hierarchy and demographics, this can be tedious sometimes pulling that employee information for our main contact. But it's really important when we get to the analysis phase to have some of these breakouts. And sometimes we want to see as many breaks as possible, but there's that balance between we want to balance the confidentiality of respondents to how can we analyze the data. So we have some thresholds of, okay, well, how many people are within this age group or tenure group? And let's look at the results if there's 5 or more. So there becomes some strategy of how do we group some things together. But this can be huge in the analysis phase.
Yeah, and then an example of how your hierarchy might look is, you're trying to set this up. What we find as we're working with clients is that their HRIS has a few glitches and problems in it, and that becomes apparent as we try to build a structure. It's very important you get this right, because when you deliver a report to somebody at the end of the process, and they look at it and say, this shows I have 12 people and I really only have 6, what's going on here? Then you get people kind of discounting the process and you lose some buy-in. So the more accurate your numbers are here, the cleaner the delivery and the data will be on the back end, and you'll have a really good experience in rolling out the results in your organization. Now, taking the survey, normally, most platforms will allow you to kind of use a email link. If everyone has an email within the organization, this is great. It's most efficient. Sometimes you have field employees or people out on the shop floor that don't have access to a corporate email. So maybe you set up a kiosk or some iPads or something like that, tablets, for them to take the survey, and there's kind of a way to get them to log in. Paper surveys are also very useful in these cases too, where it's kind of more of an analog process, but people tend to trust it a bit more. And of course, you can take surveys on mobile phones if that's kind of a policy you have in place. But there's various ways. It is a little bit more difficult when people are not at their desk, but getting participation just requires you to kind of schedule some time for them to do it, and getting manager buy-in. So your managers are saying, hey, have you taken the survey yet? Let me get you to sit down here or take this tablet and quickly, enter your information or enter your answers here so we can collect that. confidentiality.
Yeah,
is
something we've
important.
got to on the survey methods is communication templates for,
Yeah.
hey, the survey's coming out. Here, you check your email. You're going to have 2 weeks to do it. Or again, there's going to be kiosks in the break room where you can do the survey. So that's something else to, with the enablement as far as methods. Because the advertising the survey is a big deal, right? You want people to know that's happening.
And we'd love to hear other suggestions and best tricks and tips that you all have used to get good participation. So if you want to put those in the chat and share those, that would be great. Let's see. So in terms of admin, so participation is important. You know, typically you want to track it as you go, and then you can really target different populations or groups or managers to help them drive participation within the groups. Now, there's a healthy balance here. You don't want to go for 100% because then you're going to burn people out and tick people off, and you'll get reluctant survey takers who might just, you know, whatever, not be honest in their feedback. Otherwise, what the other thing that helps is if managers know that they're not going to get a report, they don't meet the threshold for 5 or more responses, for example, that's an incentive. And maybe that first year you don't get great participation because people are waiting a bit to see how this plays out and if it's safe. And then if it goes well and you build trust, they're more likely to do it the next year. And that manager that didn't get a report, they're going to be on their people to take it the next year so they can get one. So that's kind of what we see that play out. Let's see. Then we get into, I'm going to transition here to kind of reporting and insights. I want to back up because there was a question about kind of using the Gallup Q12 questions versus having a combination of other source questions. The Q12 is great. Again, it's kind of a smaller survey. We would kind of call it a pulse survey. And a lot of the items in the Q12 are not as actionable as other topics you might measure around, like, you know, do we have effective processes and procedures or good communication or training opportunities? So the Gallup Q12, we would say, is almost like measuring the overall level of engagement plus a few additional components. But if you're looking for real actionable topics to measure, then you want to be adding additional questions there to get at those things that are really frustrating for employees. What we find is that the comments at the end, like, what can we do to make this a better place to work? You can mine some of those topics out of there to say, oh, a lot of people mentioned processes, they mentioned compensation, they mentioned collaboration across departments and functions was lacking. So then you know kind of what to ask on your next survey. Let's see. Oh, integration with Slack. Yeah, if you're using Slack, that's a great way to do it, and a plug in there. And then, yeah, fewer clicks. So again, you just want to make it simple where people get the email. You know, there's a link there to click, and you're immediately in the survey and able to take it. We find just daily reminders too. So if you're getting towards the end of the window and you send out reminders every day, that'll boost participation because people will say, oh yeah, I got to get this email out of my inbox, and so they'll take it.
Yeah, the easier you can get to them, the better, for sure.
What's that, Bill?
I just was supporting what you said on like ease of use of the survey. So if you can get to the email, so, and that's where phone sometimes comes in handy. It's not always the best user experience, but people do it if they can do it on their phone in a taxi or something else. So
yeah, for sure. And so now what I wanted to do is cover a bit about how to, well, let me back up and go to my slide here, how to really look at your data. So you get a big stack of data now, and you're trying to determine what are we really going to do to analyze this data and pull out some insights. And so generally what to look for as we're looking at the these topics here are the overall score and engagement score. So is it high? Is it low? Are we doing better than most people comparatively? Did it go up or down? And then we look at the questions or the items themselves, and we sort them high to low. We look at trends, benchmark comparisons, because we're looking for the key themes. What's working? What are the strengths in the organization? And then what are the opportunities or the low scores that we want to focus on? And are any of those low scores similar questions about the same topic? Then the third piece here is really looking at demographic differences. So do the questions perform differently, or do we see more or less agreement by certain populations? So is it the manager population? Is it my field population or others? So that's where you're kind of saying, okay, it looks like these issues, these key themes we're seeing, they're more targeted or they're more acute in these certain areas as opposed to the entire organization. Finally, the comments are great place to mine insights, because you can see what people are actually saying about some of these themes that we're looking at in the data. Let me give you an example. So I just want to show you kind of how you might mine this in the tool. So we've got a platform or a dashboard here where you can look at the data. Many platforms are similar to this, where you can look at this these comparisons. Here I've got set up kind of a sample data set from 2025, as well as looking at the trend from 2024. And then there's various demographics and structures we can look at to kind of look at the data by different groups. So there's several filters that are applied here on the right-hand side. Now, when I'm looking at this, we all have this negativity bias. So what we do is we immediately sort these questions low to high to say, okay, what are the opportunities or the areas where we're seeing the most, the least amount of agreement. And so looking at this data here, you can see that working effectively across departments and functions, only 54% of people said agree or strongly agree to that statement. 21% of people disagreed with it. Now, the good news is it went up by 6% compared to what we measured in 2024. So we're making progress, but there's still some opportunity. It's still one of our lowest scoring topics. The other thing you can do is you can kind of say, well, where is this occurring? Like if that's our opportunity around collaboration, where are people feeling maybe better or worse about that statement? So here I have a view where we can look at this one question by tenure group. So now we're trying to triangulate, where are the issues? Well, if you've worked here for a long time, your perception about collaboration is much lower than the new people. Now, that's not surprising. Or we could look at manager status, and we could say managers, when they're evaluating this, their perceptions compared to non-managers on that same statement are lower. So they're kind of maybe dealing with more problems when it comes to collaboration across departments and functions. And then another thing I'll look at is, like, for managers, well, is that causing any more stress maybe within that group? And so if I look at question 8 here, manager perceptions on this topic around stress are lower compared to non-managers overall. So that tells me that, okay, so our manager population, maybe we need to work with them on this topic around collaboration, because they obviously have an opinion on it and it's not functioning as well for them as opposed to others. The other thing we can do is look at kind of how the organization performed or scored on these topics across different demographic groups. And so now we're looking for differences here. This is where I said which populations are really important to focus on. And, we basically just want to see, are there major differences with larger population groups on how they're answering some of these different statements or questions on the survey? I'll go to manager status again. Here we can see manager perceptions are slightly lower. So again, I can explore that, or what you'll want to do is explore that and say, well, let me see how manager perceptions differ on each of these different questions that we had on the survey. And
this is where I was just going to say to go. You want to look at this, you can get to the details pretty quick here.
There you go. Yeah. So talk to this one then, Skylar.
No, as far as this, I mean, this is where I like to go to look at the range on manager versus non-manager, or what are the highest scoring questions for managers or non-managers, or the lowest scoring. So right on this rankings page, rather than just saying the overall score that Charles showed, now we can get into the details and say, well, which topics are pain points for each of these groups? And you can add some of these demographics too. But if you want to sort by that range column, we can quickly see, well, which questions are the biggest differences between these groups, and where are they the same? Because sometimes, you might see in an overall score manager and non-manager really close, but they might be way apart from each other on certain topics. Some of them higher or lower. And you go, oh, I was just working with a client yesterday that their managers were really high they were really low, I should say, on how the levels of stress and workload. So we were concerned about the burnout of their managers. That group in particular was driving those scores down. And we could see that because of these breakouts. So you can get a little bit more granular and prescriptive by looking at things like this.
Yeah, and so this is where we're saying, is the theme or topic around workload across the organization, or more concentrated in certain groups like it is,
Sure.
like it is here? The other thing I like to do in terms of understanding these themes a bit more is looking at different comparisons. And so generally you can look at these topics or your high and low scores compared to benchmarks and also your trends from the previous year. So like I was mentioning earlier, if I look at, let's say, our high scores, most people agree with these statements about the teamwork questions and the supervisor questions. Those are comparing pretty well to what we would measure in the global benchmark, all of the organizations, or even a manufacturing benchmark. This organization is scoring much higher than we'd see in manufacturing. And some of these increased. One of these decreased about the supervisor treating with people with respect, but it's still above the benchmark. So we're in good shape on these higher scoring topics. On the low scoring topics, are these at or below the benchmark? How are we doing? Well, this one about working effectively across departments and functions, lower than what we see on our benchmarks, even though we made some progress, but there's still some progress to make. Communication, it's a low scoring topic, but it's a harder question because other organizations struggle with that and we're doing better than other people. So it gives you some context to say, how severe of a problem do we have essentially, or what should we really focus on? And if we put a lot of effort here, are we going to see much more of an increase? Because it seems like that's just a tough topic overall.
Yeah, if you didn't have the benchmarks, I feel like every organization would say, well, we stink at communication. We're terrible at cross-functional collaboration. And I see that again and again, the lowest 5 for clients. But then I go, well, you're still 10 points above what we see from other organizations in your industry. So yes, it's a pain point to employees. Recognize that as a pain point. However, give yourself some credit too if you're actually doing better than other organizations, because communication is just hard and change is hard. And there's certain topics that are always going to score lower and certain ones that are going to score higher. Team related questions are always going to score higher.
So then from here, what I like to do is go to the comments section, because we have these 2 questions that we ask on the survey. What are the things we need to improve and what are the greatest strengths? And we'll look at this one first. And here what we'll do is we'll just kind of apply the summarize with AI functionality. So we'll want to say, what is the overall kind of the topics or themes that are emerging from the comments? So here we see leadership and management, employee well-being and culture, operations and processes. So notice we didn't really have a question about processes that came up on the survey, but it got mentioned a lot here in terms of the comments. And so this is where we pull out some insights and maybe some other statements we want to ask on the next survey. And then you get a lot of other topics here that are kind of included in that mix. One thing you can do is, looking at topics or let's see, do I have the analysis turned on in this data set? I don't think I do. We can analyze some of these comments. Oh, I do. We can analyze these comments by different topics. So there's those process topics that got mentioned a lot. There's strategy, there's collaboration. So, 18% of the comments were about processes. Now what I can do is go back over to this page and say, okay, well, let's look at that theme independently. And there's those 66 comments. And now let's summarize that and get some ideas around just the process topic in general. So now we're seeing there's communication, decision making. They also mentioned that stuff, but some of the stuff around workflow and processes is mentioned down here. So of those 66 comments that included something about processes, here's kind of the main stuff that we can see being mentioned there. So it gives you some real strong, actionable ideas that we didn't necessarily measure specifically in the survey in this case. Same thing if you want to do like collaboration, cross-functional collaboration. We saw 43 comments there. And then you can either read them verbatim, those 43 comments, which we highly recommend doing. But we also look at these topics and say, okay, siloed work environments, cross-training, knowledge sharing. So this is the type of stuff you can kind of glean from your comments that really help you take action on some of the opportunities that are mentioned in the survey. The other sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, somebody in the comments just wrote, summarize with AI equals thumbs up. And I can't agree with that more. Like this is a game changer feature for me as I'm working with clients, because you can get pretty granular with the different topics or themes. But the summarize tool I look at it as a couple different features that are great. Leaders get emotional about comments. There's emotional reaction when you start reading actual comments. And if you can provide them with a summary that sanitizes the experience and yet still provides them with the information that they want to see. Here's what most people are talking about. And Charles and I, for years, as we've read through comments, have tried to create summaries similar to this, more verbal of like, hey, we kind of were seeing this trend or theme as we read through a sample of 100 clients. But if we've got a client that has 1,000 comments, that gets really hard to sift through 1,000 comments. And this is where this can be a game changer aspect of Summarize with AI for sure.
Yeah, and we always say, read the comments too. So if a bullet point comes up and you're like, that's weird, why did someone mention a toxic environment? I'm going to search the word toxic now and see how many times that got mentioned. So you can kind of get context. And did AI just cherry pick one person that said toxic, or are there several comments on that use that idea? I just did.
Amy actually just asked a question relevant to that. If you want to post that.
Oh yeah.
But Amy said, do you recommend just using the summary instead of reading comments, or HR reads all the comments then gives the summary to execs? It's the latter what we recommend, right? The summary is a great tool for getting to the major insights, but HR should get in there and read as many comments as possible. And to Charles's point that he just made, like, it might only mention toxic once, and that's what AI pulled out. And so you can say, this isn't necessarily true. And I had an HR representative do that with a client of mine just this last week, where they said, the AI says that there's a significant problem with this, but there was only one comment that talked about that as a significant problem. And so it was kind of pulling that up. And so we changed some of the verbiage in the summary appropriately. But yeah, Charles, any other thoughts on how you'd handle that?
Same. Yeah. Reading the comments. I have some CEOs that read all the comments every time. They just love it. And they'll just take the punches, even if they're mentioned in it, kind of thing. But it is helpful. And if you read all the comments, you really get a good feeling for what's going on in the organization. And again, don't just focus on what needs improvement, because there's lots of people that are having a really good experience. Overall, most people are agreeing with the statements on the survey. There's just a few that are not. And so you really want to kind of read what people like about working here too. What do we need to emphasize and be deliberate about? So you'll
That's
see.
Always a good reminder. You mentioned the negativity bias. Like everybody is looking for problems to solve. That's where we naturally go is let's solve these problems. But it is good to say, well, what are we doing well? And give ourselves some credit for that too.
For sure.
While still figuring out what problems to figure out.
Yeah, because I get leaders that say, well, tell us what the problems are. And I'm like, wow, you got really good scores. I'm really kind of scratching around here to find some stuff. But here's a few slight opportunities for your organization. But generally, not everyone's going to be happy. It's a big organization. There's lots going on. But you want to kind of focus in, make sure people feel listened to, and get some real actions as a result. So you can use AI. Our system has AI incorporated into it. You can export your comments and throw it into, AI, ChatGPT, and do the same. But I recommend you do it on your internal license and not to the cloud, because then the LMS has your data out there for everyone else to kind of use and leverage too. So
that's something we were really specific about with our data security, and you want to make sure not to run into that. We've had clients that have done that they just upload it, and it's a problem if they've got that data out there.
All right, so I can nerd out on that stuff all day. Let's see, I think I talked about this. So I just want to kind of reemphasize what we're trying to get to here are the real basic. What are the strengths of the organization? What are the opportunities? I'm going to take action on these things. And then also managers will receive a report that they can use within their teams that will help facilitate action planning as well. And I'll just quickly show a sample of what you typically can include or maybe want to include with that group. Because for example, if you have one department, in this case, I have just the IT department with 12 people, it shows their highs and lows, their trends that they saw. Sometimes a lot of organizations want to give them access to an online tool, but then there's some training and logging in and all this kind of stuff that you need to do. And so there's some resistance we find in terms of getting utilization in the online platform, and providing kind of a static report really helps them run through the data quickly, understand it, and then really kind of gets them to actioning on some of maybe the lower scoring topics that appeared in the survey. So some recommendations and things here. Very analog approach, but it's really effective in terms of getting the data into the hands of employees or managers. And then if you have those that want to get into the online tool, great, give them access, let them sort data. It really is beneficial though if you have more than 30 people in a department, because then you can see some demographic differences and things like that. Otherwise, we're trying to keep it simple and easy. And most managers are going to say, just tell me what to do. And so you're trying to kind of package it in a way that it gives them some clear direction.
Yeah, as we talk about that engagement maturity model, we would love it if managers had I want to see exactly what my people are saying and getting into an online platform. But our experience is that they're going to want that PDF report to just tell them what to do. And here's the areas to make improvements. And we get a lot better feedback on that. Where we have had managers have log into the system, we don't see them actually logging in. It's very low, usage rate to what we see there. So the PDF reports are actually really great that way.
Yeah. All right. So now we get to the real important part. What are we going to do with the data? So go ahead, Skylar.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll talk a little bit about the next steps. And this is where oftentimes we're passing on the baton to the organization. We're saying, hey, here's what we're seeing in your survey. Here's the major insights. And let's talk about some best practices for action planning. We can do some enablement around here. But I will say, and I like this slide where we break this out into two major categories. One, let's share the results. So executive debriefs. Let's look at what people are saying. Let's hear what people had to say. Distribute executive reports. Have managers be debriefed on what their teams are seeing in their reports. So these at an executive level, and then the manager level will distribute some reports and then what's the major insights. And then even you can see 5 bullet points down, all employee debrief or email, some sort of way of sharing out in a town hall or newsletter or an email. Hey, here's the major things we saw in the employee survey. Here's the 3 to 5 strengths we identified. Here's the 3 to 5 opportunity areas. And then talk about the next steps of action planning, which is the second major part of this, right? Let's talk about the survey and then let's action plan off of this. How can we roll this out? Let's have some team meetings. Let's have some accountability. Now, again, depending on the size of organization, this can look drastically different. Large organizations, you're going to have top-down action planning. You're going to have teams also saying, what can we do? And then also department heads throughout that too. So you're going to have different levels and different accountability. But yeah, that's where you can get pretty complex pretty quick. If you want to go to the next slide. This is where, again, kind of to the same point, we can analyze those organizational results, but then there's going to be a team level results too. And when we get to those manager debriefs, we can start to identify, perfect. I love the arrow popping up. Those team action planning and things that can come up and move to that next category of training and action planning that can happen on the team level. Again, this is kind of binomial, seeing the org level and then the team level, but there might even be some between too, where we're doing some of that. Charles, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's kind of like 2 tracks of action planning. And what your managers want to know is, hey, what's the organization going to work on? Well, we're going to focus on collaboration this year. Great. Okay. We'll talk in our teams about that too. And maybe we'll have some plans associated with it.
Yeah, you want to empower teams to take some action on their own too, but if they can align with those organization goals, all the better, right? That can make some headway there. And I like how we've got this framed out, because these things can be happening at the same time, right? Yes, you want executive leaders knowing the information first and then trickling the information out, but we can have some in tandem activities happening at the same time on the org and team levels. Now we have a couple examples to share with you. So from an organizational standpoint, we've run some seminars around this too. We call this the current state and future state exercise, where we ask leaders to define what the current state is, and then we tell them to dream big. What's the ideal future state? What would we really want realistically, but ideally to be the situation, whether it be professional growth opportunities at the organization, or what does really good communication or collaboration look like? How do we break down those silos and paint that picture of that future state? And we have them spend time in that, and we're regularly telling them, don't get to what you need to do to get there. Let's save that for last, but let's identify that future state. And then the last thing we do is say, okay, now let's build a bridge from that current state to that future state. And we'll do some exercises around some of this. Some of these are, again, this is an example of how we might identify this on top-down communication. We'd say, make a list of, hey, what are the biggest things that we'll look at as far as what we want in that future state. And then when we get back to that action planning, you're going to start to see some of these aren't realistic or we can't handle them. And we'll start to cross out current state items that aren't within the control. Now, if you're on a team level, you're probably crossing out more like, oh, we don't have budget for this. We don't have the capability of this. On the leadership level, on the executive level, they might have more bandwidth or leeway that they can say, well, we could tackle this. What's that going to take? But you want people to really still go, well, what's in our control? Make this realistic, and what can we be doing, and go from there. The last thing, again, you can start to identify and block this out and say, what do we know as far as top-down communications? What's the current state? Again, defining some of these things. Current, we're not timely, we're infrequent, and what's the ideal future state? You're going to see, timely and frequent, or you want to know what's going on, or it's rather than unprioritized, we're having prioritized. So sometimes even just identifying the problems of the current state almost helps define what do we want from the future state, somewhat of the opposite end of this. And then this is where you can then easily start to fill in that action and say, okay, what's it going to take for us to go from what don't know what's going on to we will know what's going on. Okay, focus groups and teamwork, team meetings and feedback sessions where we can hear what's going on within the organization. Or with timely, we can have weekly updates. That's going to fit in the timely and frequency, and that'll solve some of that. Prioritization will have some labels on things, right? Is this priority number one, or can this be on the back burner, and do some of that planning from there. Now, this is more from, go ahead.
I was just going to say, by holding off on actioning, these action plans materialize much easier. And then you're solving for the topic that's most important in the organization. Because like you mentioned earlier, if you jump right into suggestions and actions, you'll get all over the place and it won't be focused enough.
Yeah, and that's people's tendency. They want to go, well, here's what we want. And we can get here by this. And that's jumping. And we want to take time to hear the other voices too and say, well, let's define what that future state looks like, the ideal, and let's build that fully out and then come back, because you might have some overlap between these two, like you saw in the weekly updates. That solves two things at one time rather than talking about those individually. So it can help a lot there. From a team perspective, again, a lot of the things I shared before we want to break this out into first, let's review the results as a team, share those out, and then prioritize. Well, all right, we heard that these are 5 pain points on our team and in our department. If we were to rank order these areas, which is the biggest pain point, right? That's part of the weakness of the annual survey. We're just surveying on some limited topics and a couple different questions. So communication, professional growth might be 2 topics that come up and people go, but professional growth is much more important. You can then build some goals that are unique to the team coming out of that. Exactly.
So we've got like 2 minutes left here. So
I just saw that too, as you jumped at it, like, oh, we got to hurry.
So there's a whole process here. I wanted to we don't have time to really cover all of this, but I think a lot of what you just covered, Skylar, covers a lot of these same topics here. Anything else in these slides you'd want me to, or to?
No, I think, the next one's kind of, this one's something I think is really important. The 2 meetings, separating that. It's almost like separating the action planning as well that we see in that org structure is let people digest the feedback. What did we say? And then let them come to the table with some ideas in a separate meeting. So that's all I'd say is some best practices on action planning. Of course, we've got SMART goals and some charts here. But again, somewhat preaching to the choir. I think a lot of people here know some of these best practices. And we'll share this.
We'd say kind of keep it simple. Like choose one thing. Could be something that you're already focused on. But yeah, one thing will make a difference on people's perceptions in the future.
For sure.
You can also do this online. We have an online reporting tool goal planning tool, where you can capture this and utilize this. Makes it easier. You can see some organization reporting around some of those things. But really the idea is, as you're putting this strategy together, there's some buy-in in the organization. People generally do, once they get the data, want to react to it and do some change. So it's a catalyst for change in your organization. The hard part is maintaining momentum and getting that to happen, and to keep it simple. If you make it too complicated or there's too much going on, your likelihood of success will be lower. So try to maintain momentum throughout the year on these actions, because remember, we're committed to do a survey again, and we want to make sure we see some improvement in a response to the original survey data. So that concludes our presentation today. There's several additional things we can cover. We also do kind of more in-depth certification program on the same topic, and we'll get you some information on that as well. But if you have additional questions, please let us know, and we'd love to have you attend one of our future sessions. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks for attending, and thanks for responding to the polls too. We appreciate that. So thanks for your questions.